Hey guys, so we're back with the fourth week video, and this week I'm gonna continue talking about refining the maps, and this time it's not gonna be only the color map. We're gonna be talking about the displacement map. We're gonna be talking about our specular map. We're gonna be talking about subsurface scattering and the radius map that we're gonna be making for that. And of course, after this, we're gonna be talking about the skin shading inside Maya with Arnold. So to begin with, I will show you first the adjustments that I made on the color map. So the last thing that we added last week to the color map, that's exactly how it looked like the last week. So if you remember, guys, we added some finer details using our convexity map, and yeah, it made it pretty detailed. So you can see that without it looks like this, and when we added our convexity map on a multiply, and then we made like a color balance to transform our black colors into kind of reddish colors. So let me quickly grab the maps and show you guys, because we had like a convexity map and then ambient occlusion map that we baked in Nald, a software called Nald, Knald, and this software, you just feed it your displacement map, and then it gives you other maps based on this, like for example normal map, concavity map, convexity map, ambient occlusion, and other maps. But what I really need while texturing, especially for the color map, I always use the convexity and the ambient occlusion. So I use the convexity map for like finer kind of wrinkles and pore details, and I use the ambient occlusion for like bigger wrinkles, and kind of like the darker areas and the peaks and valleys on the surface of the model. So I will show you quickly. So we had this as a convexity map, and what I'm doing is that in Mari I use the color balance adjustment stack to convert these black lines to kind of reddish color, and then I use it on a multiply mode, and then when I do this I have kind of like a darker skin tone, pores and skin wrinkles details, and I use it to give the face more details, and at the same time like add a darker color to wherever the skin is deep or is wrinkling. So we have this one, and also we got this one, which is the ambient occlusion, and I do the same with this one. So again, I just use it as multiply, and I add an adjustment stack to it to color balance it to be reddish instead of black. And this one, as you can see, it has like the bigger wrinkles and the bigger pores and all the like the dark areas in the skin where the skin is folding, or there's like valleys on the surface of the face. So yeah, as you can see here, what we did with the convexity is that we added this color balance, and in the color balance I was like adjusting the shadows, the mid-tone. Don't adjust the highlights because it goes crazy. So I was just adjusting the shadows and the mid-tones and crank them up a little bit in the cyan or red. And the other thing I did is I added my ambient occlusion map, and I did the same thing, and I use it on a very, very slight. For example, if you can see also here on the convexity, You can see that I'm not using it 100%. I'm just using it very, very slightly to just add this kind of subtle details, not so heavy-handed, not very fake and painted by hand. I don't want to get this results. So if you can see the whole face, it still looks nice when this is added. It still looks realistic. So I do the same with my ambient occlusion. So as you can see with the ambient occlusion, you can kind of see like the bigger details, like the wrinkles, especially on his forehead and around his eyes. So without is like this, which is flat a little bit, and then with, you can have that we got like some really nice details. Like you can also see it on the lips. So with the ambient occlusion, we have nicer details. So this is also very handy to add. After that, I added a Hue Shift, because when I was looking at references of Bryan Cranston or Walter White, I could see that his skin is not like the most rosy or cheeky. So his skin was more like kind of yellow, kind of less lively, if I could say. So that's what I tried to do, is that I started to adjust my colors to get this kind of like a yellowish overall instead of like a reddish overall healthy face. Maybe that's because his skin is a little bit thick, or maybe because he's a little bit older. So that's what I tried to do. So I added this Hue Shift, so without and with. And then after that, I started to add the spots on his forehead. And this one, it looks like painted by hand, so I wanted it to look nicer. So I made this kind of cloud layer. And with this cloud thing, if I hide my mask, you will see it like all over the face. And what I did is that when you go here in procedural, adding a procedural layer, you can add a fractal, and then in fractal you can add cloud. And this, I really love to use this one, because you can get like a kind of procedural noise that doesn't look like it's fake. It's a little bit kind of natural, the way it reacts with the textures. So I use it all the time, the Fractal Cloud procedural noise. And so it was set on soft light. If I set it on normal, you will understand how it looks like. So that's how it looks like. And then you can control here from the size, like the size of your clouds noise. So if you want it to be like kind of like bigger, you can go as big as this, or you can make it like really, really small and noisy like that. So if I go back to how it was, and yeah, so that's how it looks like. And then here in color A and color B, you can control the colors. So for example, I am choosing these two colors, the white and kind of like a dark skin color. So I'm using white because I know that when I use it on either multiply or soft light or whatever, then the white is not gonna show, and I can only get like the darker colors from the dark skin colors. That's why I'm using white and a dark skin color. And then if I go again to soft light, so that's how it looks like with soft light. And then I added a mask and painted this mask to cover only the area where I need him to have like spots on the top of his like kind of foreheads. And then yeah, and then when I was again looking at some of the references for him, I can barely see the red in his lips. So his lips is almost the same color as his skin. Sometimes you can see it in some photos, but in most of the photos his lips are really light. So as you can see here and here. So and even here, you know, the only way that you can see that it's a little bit reddish here is because of the shadows with the subsurface scattering. Other than that, you can see like the color of his lips is not that kind of pink or red. So what I did is that his lips was really kind of purple dark color, and if you see it with a shader on, it looked very purpley. So what I did is that I added a Hsv adjustment stack, adjustment layer, and then I made his lips color almost as his skin, and then I added another one, and in this one I brought back the kind of reddish color that's in the middle of the lips, so that now I can have like the kind of reddish colors in the middle of his lips, and then on the other side, on the other one, on the bottom and on the top, I still have this kind of almost the same skin color textures on the edges of his lips. And then what I did next is that I added a little bit of making his forehead lighter. Here you can see before and after. And again, guys, I mentioned this like 1,000 times in previous video that we need to make very subtle changes, and a lot of subtle changes. If we go crazy with changes, it will start to look fake and plastic, and it's like painted by hand, and we don't want to have this feeling. That's why I add a lot of layers with a lot of changes that are very subtle. So as you can see again in the forehead, it's added with an adjustment, and then it's like dialed really down. And then the variations is yeah, okay. So this is again another very subtle thing. So I added this to make like the color of his head itself a little bit lighter, because like I told you guys, because of how the hair is obscuring any light or any sunlight from the skin. So even if it's shaved, it should have like the scalp itself should be like a little bit lighter color. And then when we add our hair, our kind of like shaved hair, it's gonna start to look like greenish or gray. But this will happen with the groom, and if it doesn't, then this is something that we're gonna fix on the textures after seeing how it looks like with groom. And this is another layer with some skin variations. So yeah, again, this one I added to make the area like his eye bags here, and the brows and the bridge of his nose. I wanted to make it lighter because it looks like this in his skin. In his skin, it always looks lighter in this area, like the kind of like that triangle in the middle of his face. Here also you see that it looks lighter than his skin color. So I try to add that. And then this one is eyes. So yeah, I was just painting around the eyelids. And then wrinkles. So for this one, it was basically making the wrinkles darker and deeper, because it wasn't showing when I started testing the skin shader. It wasn't showing enough, so I basically just went in there and painted the wrinkles darker, with darker kind of reddish color, So yeah, and then this one, yeah, just making his eyes a little bit kind of more yellowish, kind of like a really desaturated bluish color to achieve this this area of thin skin around the eyes. So yeah, that was it, guys, for the color map. And then another thing that I wanted to show you guys is when I started skin shading this character. I will show you some images. The overall skin color was a little bit kind of waxy. Let me get that. So yeah, here. So it was like there was specular lights everywhere and was starting to look waxy like everywhere. And this is an older test with the kind of reddish face. And then what I try to do is that I try to paint a specular map to make the parts in the face that's reflecting specular light to be only in some certain areas, or to be like stronger in some certain areas and weaker in others. Like for example, I made it stronger on the nose, I made it stronger on the lips, I made it stronger on the forehead, a little bit on the edges of the ears, a little bit on the chin. So what I did is basically this, and on this one you can see that it is not specky everywhere now. It is more specky in areas like on the nose, on the forehead, on the lips, and on the part of the chin, but it is not as specky in other areas. Like for example, it was very specky before on the neck and in the areas in the shadows, but it is not anymore after adding a specular map. I will show you the specular map. And sometimes when you're testing your skin shader, you see things like, for example, this area is very specky, but you, or maybe even like the whole skin shader, you might start to think like it is a little bit waxy, it is a little bit specky, but you always have to have in mind that you're gonna add the groom later. For example, when I add groom, I always add peach fuzz, which is the very, very tiny, small hair that you have all over your face. And the peach fuzz, most of the times, break away this kind of shiny and waxy effect. So if your skin shader is not waxy enough, it will start to look like a plastic once you start grooming and adding finer groom like beach fuzz or things like that. This is the case also here on the head. I'm sure that all these reflections are gonna be duller or less strong once I add my groom. So that's why I don't bother that much with the skin shader and the specularity of it in the beginning, especially when the test is with samples that's not as high as you will do in your final render. So that's why I don't bother that much with the specular on the skin or how waxy the skin is. I don't go crazy. Of course I try to get it as perfect as I can, but I don't obsess over it in this stage yet. I want to see it all with eyes. I want to see it with groom. I want to see it with the high samples like I'm gonna use in my final render. And this is when I start to decide if I need my speculars to be stronger, to be weaker, if I need to adjust my specular map, if I need to fix something in my subsurface scattering itself. But in this stage, something like that I would be really happy with. So let's go back again to Mari and show you how I made my specular map. So I was using my displacement channel to make my my specular map. So if we remove this and if we remove this one, then this one here, yeah, we don't need this one. No levels. So if you remember, guys, what we had in our displacement map, the one that we painted using the Mari maps, we always end up with this kind of purple map that is the three channels combined, the tertiary, secondary, and micro, the RGB combined. And then when we use a copy channel adjustment layer, when we use the copy channel, we can choose which channel we want. So like we showed before, the red is the one that you get like the secondary map from, and then green is the one that you get the tertiary, and then blue is the one that you get the micro. So what I did is that I added this copy channel to get like the green map, and then I added another layer, levels, and in levels, if you go down there in the input level, I dialed down all my, like the white, the mid, the black. I want to get something as contrasty as this, so you can see that any pore details or wrinkles is in black, and anything that's like the surface of the skin itself is white. And I try to make it as contrasty as possible, but in the same time, I don't want it to look ridiculous, you know. So don't make it like very, very sharp. And then what I do afterwards, so this is how it looks like, okay? And then what I did after that is that I added again, you remember the procedural cloud thing? I add a cloud with black and white and try to make this the size of it. You remember I told you that you can control the size of the clouds here, and I try to make like the size to match the one on the face, because if you remember, guys, the maps that we had, we could only paint the face. We didn't have information like for the neck or for the back of the head or for ears. So what I did is that to try to find something that works instead of this, I added a cloud procedural layer, and I tried to get it as close as possible to the colors and the scale of my texturing XYZ displacement. And of course, I just made it all over the head, and then I added a mask. And then, if for you guys who don't know how masks works, you can just like go here and then add layer mask, add mask, and then when you go to reveal all or hide all, for example, if you click hide all, it will hide everything, and then you will paint back again using your white color the areas that you need. So that's what I did. I just painted back in the areas that I needed. So I went to like UVs, and I had like the back of the head, and I had the neck and the ears, and these are the only areas that I painted with my cloud procedural map to bring it back. And then after that, I added another layer, and in this layer, let me remember. Oh yeah, so in this layer, what I did is that I didn't have the information like the bigger wrinkles. I didn't have this information on my texturing XYZ displacement maps. It was only on my sculpt. So what I did is that I painted these back in black. So I used a black color to paint back the areas where there was wrinkles. So this way that, because Specular Map works this way, anywhere that it's gonna be black, it's gonna be rough and less specky, and anywhere that is white is gonna be specky and it's gonna bake light. And then after I finished that, I added a multiply layer with a gray color, and that's how it looked like without the mask. And then what I did next is that I added a mask, and in this mask I painted back, or maybe you should say like I removed the gray from all the areas that I want to be lighter, like for example on the lips, the chin, the nose, the cheeks, the forehead. And this way I made my specular map so that the head, the back of the head, or like the neck, or like the brows, these areas doesn't, or the side of the head, I didn't want these areas to be like as specular as the front of the nose or the eyelids or the cheeks or lips. So this is basically the map that I used for my as a specular map. And then another map that I painted is a subsurface radius. So previously I would use like a solid color for my my radius, subsurface radius, but this time I used a map to like make a variation, so it is yellowish in areas that's not as fleshy, that has like bones or fats in them, and I made it like more reddish in areas that has like blood, a lot of blood vessels underneath, like on lips and on ears, on nose, and I will show you guys how I made that. So yeah, basically is that I imported my color map, and then I added a saturation adjustment layer. And as you can see, I just like cranked my saturation high, and then I got this result already. So out of the blue, I already have a result that I can use. And then I added a adjustment, an Hsv adjustment. So for this, guys, I just like go here and then add whatever adjustment I want. And yeah, it's called just adjustment layers, okay? So I added an Hsv, and in this Hsv I shifted the hue to be more kind of yellowish, and this way I can get the areas where there is more bones or fat. And then I use this mask. So if I hide the mask, that's how it looked like after I shifted the hue to be more yellowish. And then I masked anywhere that I want it to be more reddish, like we said before, like the nose, the lips, the ears. And after that, I added another one to make it like stronger in the areas that are bony or has like fat. Like here there is like thicker skin and it's fat, and here there is more like kind of bony areas. And that's the one that I use for my radius, my subsurface radius. So that's basically all the layers that I use, all the maps. All the maps that I've been using. I might need more. If I need more, I'm gonna use it. But for now, like testing the skin shader and see how it looks like, that's enough for me. And then I will show you now in Maya how I use these maps and how I started like making the scene and starting the skin shading. So hey guys, now we are in Maya, and this is how the scene that I set up to test the skin shader and the maps on the head that I have for Walt is. And as you can see, I only have the head, I have like the lights, And this lighting setup that I use, it was basically after looking at this reference. So I'm using the same lighting setup that I used for mic for now, but I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm gonna change it later or if I'm gonna use the same thing. So that was like the kind of lighting mode that I did for mic, and that was my reference for the lighting. It is not the best resolution, but I could see like how the lights looked like, and that's the lighting that I used for my mic portrait. And then I try to use the same light for now for Walter. And the first thing that I want to talk about, guys, just like some tips about portraits in general, and like the scale and how the skin shader would react differently and things like that. Like, for example, the first thing that I want to talk about is this image. And in this image, if you just like Google human face scale or human face average scale, you're gonna find this photo. And it's like a study that was done to see like the average scale of the like human faces or heads in general. And then in this one, what I did is that when I was looking at the average length of faces, I have found that if you can see on this one, this is what we need, like the length from the chin to like the top of the head. And on this one, you can see that it is number 14. It says here number 14. So on number 14, it says here menton to top of the head. And then this is like the vertical distance from the tip of the chin to the level of the top of the head. So 50%, the percentiles, so 50th is like the average. And you can see here like men or women, and in men it's like 23 centimeters. And that's why I always try to like measure my head to be, it shouldn't be exactly that, just like roughly in this kind of average. And having a correct scale is gonna help you a lot to make something look realistic when it comes to shading. And this is kind of like the roughly the measurement that I use when I'm making my portraits. So that's the first thing, is that you try to measure the head that you are shading to be like from the chin to the top of the head, like for example like that, to be an average of 23 centimeters. That's of course if it was a male. So try to look at this image, and it's also like really informative in terms of other measurements, like for example the distance between the end of the eyes, or like the from the center of pupils. So it has a lot of measurements that's really useful if you want to like make a realistic portrait. So I use this roughly as my measurement guide. And then that's the first thing that I want to talk about. The second thing that I want to talk about, guys, is that when you're using Arnold for shading, try to always make your model kind of closed. There is no holes in it, because it gives this, when you add a subsurface scattering to the skin shader, it gives it this kind of reddish, weird, waxy, extra lighting to wherever the model is not closed. So that's why I quickly closed like the neck area, and I have everything closed, like inside the mouth, in the nose, and the eyes, and the ears. Everything is closed. So that's another thing that I want to talk about. The other thing is that when you use the scale, the correct scale, it will be easier also to use the scale for the skin shading. So as you can see here, what I have is the color map, like the final version of the color map applied to the model, And again, like I told you guys, this is the lights that I'm using. And for the lights I'm just basically using like Arnold area lights. So nothing fancy. If you see like my lights here, I'm always something try to remember to use is to disable the normalize, because when you have normalize, you really need like really strong lighting to see what's happening. So I try to uncheck normalize. Another thing that's good to have is to have a high sample. Of course, this will take from your render time, but it gives you like more realistic and nice results when you have high samples. Like I like to use 3. Sometimes I use 2 when I'm testing, and then I go up to 3 or even 4 when I'm doing my final render. And then I always use like the intensity and the exposure to see how strong my light is. And then the other thing that I found that is really helpful is adding a texture, or kind of like a light texture to your lighting, so that you don't get this weird square light on the eyes. So you have like a nicer. Let me show. I was just playing around with the eyes. So yeah, so if you can see here, like you have kind of like a nicer light reflection on the eyes when you're using a texture on your light. So you can like get any photo of lights and then use it as a texture. So yeah, this is the one that I'm using. It's like a photo of light, and I'm using this one as texture for my lights. So yeah, I have one light like going from like 3/4 direction, one light from top, and one huge light that's really soft, like from the back. And that's how I have this kind of lighting setup. So in this area I have my key light, which is coming from the 3/4 direction, which is like the strongest and the more dominant light. And you can see like all the shadows are like going on the opposite direction of this light. And then my fill light is the huge one that I'm using here. Is like kind of like a you can see even like from the intensity, it is not as intense. Like this one is really intense. It has like an intensity of 8 and an exposure of 3. This one has an intensity of 2, exposure of 1. And that's why when you're doing your renders, I will use this one as a very soft kind of fill light. And then the other one, that's my key light, is really strong, and it is the one dictating the direction of the light. And then as you can see up here is the light that's coming from the top light. And again guys, I'm just using this based on my observation on this. So I thought that he might have like kind of like a key light coming from this direction, and then a fill light coming from here, and then top light to get this kind of nice lighting and reflections on the top of his head. So yeah, so that's how I set up my light. And then let's talk about the head and I use my third subdivision from ZBrush. Sometimes I use the second. You can even use the first, but of course it makes your life easier. If you're in production, if you're working on a film, we actually use this kind of like resolution for our characters. So we go this crazy when we are working in film. If you're working in a like on kind of like a lower budget project with like computers that's not as strong and render farms that's not as strong, then you might go lower, like use your first subdivision or second subdivision. But I find it always easier and better, and helps the displacement map to catch a lot of details in a better way when I use a higher subdivision. That's why I use, for example, my second or my third subdivision, and that's what I'm doing here. So in my ZBrush file here, I go in my geometry. Let's go back to the head so we can see it. So in my geometry here, I am going to my third subdivision, and then I export this as my base mesh. And of course, remember guys, this is very important. When you're using the third subdivision or the second or whatever, remember when you start to bake your displacement maps, to bake the displacement map based on this subdivision. So if I go here to my, to multi-map exporter, I go to displacement, export options. So this is how I do my displacement map. First of all guys, subtools, you use this one if you have like, if for example, if the head and the eyes, both of them, they are on different subtools, okay? I have the head and I have the eyes, and both of them, they share the same UVs, okay? Like let's, for example, say that they are on the same UV tile. So what I do is that I use subtools and I use merge maps, and this way, when I bake my maps, it's gonna be all baked in the same map. So I will have the head and the eyes displacement maps in the same map. That's the only occasion that you would use subtools and merge maps. Other than that, if I'm only baking it for one subtool that's not sharing any UVs with any other thing, I'm not checking my subtools or merge maps. And then the other thing is the map size. So I'm picking 8K maps. If you're making 4K or whatever, you can just choose one of these. And if, for example, I'm choosing and you don't have like 8K, just go to the end and it's an 8K map. And then the other thing is to, of course, make sure that you have flip V, because as I told you before, guys, ZBrush always flips your UVs. But this is, I'm sure that you will have it turned on automatically in your default ZBrush. And then the other thing I do is that I click on export options, and then I go to my displacement map to see my export options in my displacement map. And if you remember, guys, when we were baking some maps that we were going to use in nulls to get our occlusion and convexity maps, I told you to not bother a lot with the displacement export options. But now when we are baking our displacement map, we want the nicest results, because this is going to be the kind of details that we're going to get in our shader. So what I do is that this is the part that I wanted to tell you guys about. In the subdiv level, this is, you put the number of the subdivision that you want your maps to be baked on. For example, I'm using my third subdivision, so that's why I have my third subdivision in the subdiv level. So this way that ZBrush will understand that this is gonna be my base mesh, and it is gonna bake my map based on this base mesh. If you're gonna use the second subdivision, then of course put it on 2. If you're gonna use the first subdivision, then put it on 1. And then next thing is that I activate adaptive. Adaptive and the subpix, these two, they are kind of like they are not that necessary, because they are basically make your map catch every fine and small detail, like really micro details. So it takes really longer when it comes to baking the map, but it is nice because you can catch all the details that you have in your sculpt. So I have my adaptive on, and I have my DP subpix on 4, and then smooth UVs, of course. And my med, I use my med on 0. It also depends if you're working in a company Like for example, when we were at Framestore, we were using a mid at 0. At MPC, they use a mid at 0.5. So it's up to the kind of like render engine that they are using. Maybe because at MPC they use RenderMan, so they use 0.5, and in Framestore they use kind of an Arnold related render, so it is about on 0. But because I'm using Arnold, I think that 0 gets the best results for me. And then 3 channels, 32-bit EXR. And of course, you don't need to go as high as 32-bit. 16-bit is going to be enough, and you can only make it like a TIFF, like a 16-bit TIFF. But again, if you have a strong computer and you can work with higher resolutions and higher samples, then why not go all the way up? And then of course scale has to always be on 1, and then intensity on 0, and that's basically it. So that's how I pick my map. And then let's go back again to Maya. So yeah, that's basically it. When it comes to like preparations, the other thing that I would say is that we talked about the scale, closing the mesh. The other thing is, yeah, let's talk about like kind of like the very basics of Arnold. Like I told you guys, this tutorial, the whole Walter White tutorial is gonna be a very fast one that we're gonna be talking like quickly about everything that's related to making realistic portraits, and then we're gonna start making other tutorials that's gonna be very specific. Like for example, we're gonna take our time to make a tutorial that's only based on sculpting a head in ZBrush, like from a sphere, and like sculpting a skull first, and then going from the skull to sculpting the head, and then like getting a likeness of a celebrity or something like that. And then when we're gonna make another texturing or shading tutorial, we're gonna be like going in depth about like the basics of Arnold or the basics of Mari. We can do all of that, but I just wanted to quickly get something out there so you guys would have like a general idea about the whole pipeline of the thing. And that's why I don't go like in crazy details now, but we're gonna do that, so don't worry about this. So just quickly about Arnold, the things that I try to keep or have in mind when I'm using Arnold. So the idea is that in Arnold you have kind of like the AA, and this is like your samples, and your samples is like divided into these kind of things like the diffuse and the specular and the transmission, the subsurface and the volume indirect. And then what you would do is that, like, basically I think the default is like 3, 2, 2. Everything is on 2, and then the AA or the sampling is on 3. That's nice, but it's gonna be noisy when you're doing so. It's nice for like for testing. So if you can see, for example, here when I was testing some stuff here. So here when I was testing that, I was using the default 3, 2, 2. And then when I want to go higher to see like kind of like finer details, so I go with samples of 7, for example, you know. So I keep everything as it was, and I only go higher in the AA samples. Especially if you're making like a still frame, it is okay to do it like that. And yeah, it's just don't get caught in the headache of like playing around with sampling. You can find a lot of videos on YouTube about optimizing your sampling, but it is easier to just go higher in the AA sampling while keeping your everything else the same number. And then when you find something getting noisy, like for example, if I find my subsurface getting noisy, then I go higher in my SSS. So that's why when I go higher and I go like, for example, 7 in samples, and I still feel like my subsurface still noisy, my subsurface scattering is still noisy, I might go up to 3 in my subsurface scattering. If my speculars are still noisy, then I would go higher in my specular. If my diffuse or whatever, or transmission, then I just go higher in this thing. And the way that you can see this is if you go here to Aovs, you can select any of the Aovs. This is basically like the render passes. So you can select any of the Aovs that you want, and then after you selecting them, you just click on this button and then it will add it to your active Aovs. And these are the Aovs that you will be able to see. Like for example, if I go here, I have my beauty, and then I have the coat, which is my secondary specular, and I have the specular, my main specular, and I have my SSS, for example. So if I find my SSS, if I go to my AOV of SSS and I find that it is noisy, then I go to my samples, and I go to my samples here, and then I go higher in my SSS. If I go to my specular and I find that it is noisy, then I go here and I go higher on my specular. But just if you're lazy like me, you just go higher, and you have like a good computer, of course. If you have not that strong computer, then it is better to optimize and to make sure that you're only adding whatever you need. I just go higher in my sampling and I keep everything the same. So yeah, that's basically the sampling part and the AOVs part. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the shader itself. So for the shader itself, if we see here, so this is my head shader, and what I have here in my head shader, this is basically an AI standard material. So if you go here, click tab, AI standard, and then you have this AI standard surface. Okay, so if I have this one here, that's the basic, the very default Arnold 5 AI standard shader. And you can see here the base, and then the specular, the coat, the transmission, the subsurface, and whatever, and everything that you will need to make a shader. So what I do is that I try to name my shaders, and then as you can see here, the first thing that I start with is that when I add my color map, I don't add it in my base color. What I do is that I add my color map in my subsurface color. So in my subsurface color here, guys, if you can see, here is my subsurface color, and I have here my color map. So yeah, this is where I add my color map. I add it into the subsurface color, and I have here a remap Hsv, and this way I can control with these ramps or curves. I can control my hue, saturation, and value. I play around with it after rendering in Maya to see if I want to make it a little bit yellowish, a little bit reddish. If I want to make it more saturated, less saturated. If I want to make it lighter or darker using the value. So I use a remap Hsv. So I get my out color to the color here in the remap Hsv, and then my out color of the remap Hsv to my subsurface color. So that's for the color map. So the color map that I showed you in Mari, the one that we painted, I just go to my shader here in the subsurface, and then I add the subsurface color. I add my map here, and then as you can see, I always keep the weight on 1. And for the radius, as I showed you the map that I showed you, this is the map that I use for my radius color. Something else, if you want to keep your life easier, you can just basically select a color. So if I go here, come on, and then I break connections, for example, I can just go here in radius, and you have this red color. And then if you just choose this color, you can just use this as your radius color. For example, on mic, that's the color that I was using on my radius. I wasn't using a map. So you're welcome to do that. The scale, and this is a very, very important part when it comes to skin shading, guys. Most of the people think that because Arnold and Maya are based on real scale, so they use a scale of 1, especially that if we have our head on real life scale, like I told you, like that 23 or whatever centimeters from top of the head to the bottom of the chin. So I struggled a lot when I was learning how to do like proper skin shading, because I was always using the scale of 1, and it was horrible. I was always using my color, my subsurface color, instead of using a color on my color map. I was using my color map in my base. That's the mistake that I was making. I was using my color map on base, and I was using a scale of 1, and I was never getting any realistic results when I was doing this. So the correct way that I discovered after like struggling a lot for almost like 2 years is to have my color map attached to my subsurface color, to add a radius of a kind of reddish color, and to have my scale, to play around with my scale until I find the skin to look perfect, not waxy and not too plastic. And for example, in my scene here, the correct scale is 0.1, and I'm not like really big into technical things, but I think it's because Arnold is based on like the measurement unit in Arnold maybe is 1 meter, not 1 centimeters, and in Maya I'm using 1 centimeters. I don't know, so that's why it's 0.1 and it's not 1. But it works fine with me, and as you can see, the result looks nice on 0.1. So just keep playing with it. I don't care about someone who's telling me try to stay physically correct and all of that. Whatever looks nice to you, whatever looks realistic to you, that's what's physically correct. This is my opinion. So I use a scale of 0.1 in this case. And then the other important thing is the random walk and the diffusion. When I use random walk, I get a very, very more realistic results. When I use random walk, I get this kind of like grayish, greenish kind of differentiations in colors next to the reds, which is how it looks like in real life, guys. So if you see in real life, you always have this kind of like green, gray next to the red and the yellow, and that's the layer of realism. So you can see here, you see that it starts to, when it starts to get like to an edge, it starts to get like greenish, and then when you go in again, it starts to get red. So you see here, it's like from red to green, and this kind of results you don't get when you're using the diffusion. You only get when you're using random walk. So you see this kind of greenish and grayish areas, and then here, and then they are like next to more reddish results. For me, that makes the skin look so much more realistic. You can see it even here. So here. So that's why I use random walk and I don't use diffusion. So basically that's it for the subsurface part. Okay, so what is more important than the subsurface scattering, guys, is the specular. Okay, so for my specular, I try to use like two kinds of speculars. I use my specular tab, of course, and I use my quotes, right? So I use the specular. If I go here, specular, I use my specular to be basically like the finer kind of pointy, like really white speck, and then I use my coat to be like the overall dull kind of lighting, and then both of them together, they will give me this kind of specular that looks like the human skin. So if I go back again here to the article that I wrote before, if you see in this article here, I shared this photo. It's taking so long. So yeah, if you see in this photo, this is from the Digital Emily, and I really recommend this, guys. Just try to check the Digital Emily project, try to download the project files, try to study it, and see how they were trying to achieve like a realistic human skin. So this is an image from the research that they were doing, and they were using this kind of bloom speck, which is kind of like a really soft, an overall soft speck, and then the sharp speck, which is very, very sharp and like very shiny, but it's like very narrow. So this is like a wide, soft specular, and this is like a very narrow, sharp specular. And then when you have these two layers together, you get this kind of layer. And this is how the human skin reacts to light. This is how our skin is, the specular in our skin looks like. So that's what I try to do here, is that I try to work on my specular to look like that. So it looks kind of really sharp and narrow speck. And then I go to my coat, which is like a really soft and diffused and wider speculars, and together they will give me this kind of specular. So if you see here in my specular, on the weight, I'm using the map that I showed you guys here, because sometimes I don't even use a map, and I get away with it because the Arnold 5 shader is amazing, and because I have a lot of details in my displacement map, so it helps me to get away without painting specular maps. But in the case of Walter, I didn't like how the specular looked like on the skin, so I had to paint this map, and this is the one that I'm using. So it's basically kind of like maybe like 0.5 here, and then like 1 here maybe. So whenever it's white, it gets like more light, more speck, and whenever it's black, it gets no speck at all. So that's the map that I'm using currently on my specular. I use it in the weight, and then the color, I just keep it simple, white. Sometimes you might go fancy and try to make it a little bit bluish, because that's how the specular color looks like in real life. Sometimes I do that, but I don't get the strong specular that I'm after. So that's why I use just white. And roughness, this is where you play around with your model and keep testing until you find a roughness that looks nice, that doesn't look like plastic, and in the same time that doesn't look like it's dead. So you try to get something that you're happy with. In my case, 0.35 was fine for me. And then the IOR, and this is very important, guys. So the IOR for human skin is 1.38. So if we're trying to keep it a little bit realistic, we try to always use this IOR for everything that is fleshy. So I use it even for eyes. When I'm making eyes, I use this IOR. But what I'm sure of is that for skin, it is 1.38. I'm sure someone is gonna say that they saw it somewhere else in some scientific researches that was something else, but this is the number that I know about, that I use, and I know that is correct for me. So I always use an IOR of 1.38. And then this is my first specular, like I told you guys, and this is the result that I get from my first specular. It is not the most amazing specular yet. I might work on it again, but like I told you in the beginning of the video, I just get in the ballpark of something that looks nice for now, until I finish everything, until I finish grooming, especially grooming, and see that how the skin looks like after the grooming, especially after the peach fuzz, because that's how the skin looks like in real life. If you see any skin in real life, it always has the very finer hairs that are the beach fuzz. I don't know if you can see it in the recording, guys, but this affects your specular and your skin shader and your color map, everything. So that's why it's very obvious here. That's why I don't go crazy until I have everything done, and then I start to like really refine every little bit in my work. And then let's go to the coat, which is this one. On the coat, I didn't use a map because it's like soft light, so it will not affect my model that much. It wasn't looking like really specky, so I didn't use a map for it. I can use the same map and just play around with the values, so like make it more like darker, and then use it as my coat. So for my weight, I use 3. I use 3 here to get this kind of softer specular, and the color white again, and then the roughness is 0.6. So as you can see, it's rougher now because I want like kind of wider, softer speculars. And the IOR is still the same, 1.38. And again, combined, I have this. And that's the coat. So we talked about, in the base there is nothing basically, so we talked about specular, subsurface, coat, and yeah, that's basically it. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, let's see how the shader also looks like here, guys. So I have my specular map attached in the specular, and let me show you this. When you have a specular map, you always try to keep the color space raw, and you always try to check alpha is luminance. So for specular map, for bump map, for displacement map, try to keep your color space as raw, and try to always turn on alpha is luminance. Okay, guys? So this is very important. For your color map, just keep it sRGB if you're working in sRGB. Make it linear or raw when you're working in linear color space. But it is very important, especially the alpha is luminance. This is really important, alpha is luminance, so that it would understand your map, like the whites and the blacks. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, yeah, here is my displacement map, and as you can see again in the displacement map, the color space, Arnold does it automatic for you for the displacement map. Once you attach a file in the displacement shader, it just make the color space raw, and it makes the alpha luminance for you. Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to talk about, guys, is that if I go here, so I think now we talked about everything in this shader. So if I go back again to my model here in Maya, and if I select my model and I go to the Hue shape, so if this is your head and this is your like shape node, in the shape you find in under Arnold these things, okay, these attributes. So the most important thing we need for now is to go to subdivision and then subdivide it using, basically you will find it on none. So we use Cat Clark. So the subdivision that Arnold uses is Cat Clark. So again, guys, if you go to your head geo shape and you go underneath Arnold, you just keep going, and then in subdivision you use Cat Clark, and then the iterations, this is how many times you want to subdivide it. So if you're testing and you don't have like a really strong computer while you're testing, you might need like an iterations of 2, but then for your final result, try to subdivide it as much as it is subdivided in your sculpt, because that's how you see it. So for example, now I have my model subdivided 7 times, but I'm using my third subdivision as my base mesh. So it is basically subdivided 4 times after my base mesh, which is the third subdivision. So that's why I have here my iterations on 4, and this way it will look like how it looks in ZBrush. So this is very important. Try to subdivide it on Cat Clark and add the iteration, and that's the only way that you're gonna see the displacement map details happening. Other than that, you will not be able to see any details. It will basically just render your base mesh. It will not add any details. And then the other thing in the displacement attributes, in this one, you can check auto bump to like add an extra kind of fine micro details. I don't see that it is necessary, and it takes a longer time to render, but maybe if you want you can just check this. And in height here you can use these guys to like if your displacement looks like strong, like really strong, you can use this to bring it to like 0.8 or 0.7, and then it's not gonna get all the displacement that you're using. It will be like maybe 0.7 of your displacement strength. Or even if it's like not that strong and you want it to look stronger, you can make it higher here, like make it 1.2 or something like that. So that was the important part about whenever you're using displacement map for anything, when you're rendering with Arnold and you want to apply a displacement map to it. So you have to subdivide it, subdividing Cat Clark, and then add your iterations. Okay, guys? So that's really important. What else we didn't talk about so far? I think that's it in terms of skin shader. Yeah, the other thing that I'm using here to like see nicer results, like more realistic results, is that if I go to my outline here, I have this box here, guys. So if I remove this out of the way, I have this tiny box, and in this tiny box I added to like the tip of the nose of my character. And if you have, I think it was in display, heads up display, yeah. So in heads up display you have object details and you have poly count. So I always keep these two on. So my poly count is like on the left of my screen here, which is give me the poly count of like the verts, the edges, the faces, and whatever. And then I have here the object details, which appears on the right of my screen. And in the object details, the most important thing for me is these last two things, because it shows me the distance from the camera of the object and the selected objects. So if I'm like selecting something, I know how many objects that I have selected. This one is going to be very helpful when we start grooming, to see how many guides that you're maybe you're like selecting a guide and you can't see that you're selecting a guide in the other side, and then you will see that it says 3 objects while you're selecting only one guide, so you know that you selected more than one guide and you can just unselect them before you screw them up. So the most important thing for me now is the distance from the camera. And what I do is that when I have my camera, yeah, and that's good that I remember this so we can talk about the camera. So if I go here in my panels, and then I have my camera one, it's the camera that I set up. And in this camera, you can see now the distance from camera is not changing anymore, because now this is the distance between the tip of the nose of my character and the camera lens. So I use this distance in my camera. If I go to my camera here, attribute editor, and then in the attribute editor, if I go to Arnold, yeah, if I go to Arnold, there is this enable depth of field, and then when I check this, I enable the depth of field, and then I add the focus distance, which is the distance that I can see here when I'm selecting the box. So if I select the box again, so just copy this number, and then if I go back again to my camera, attribute editor, and then I add this number here, and then I can choose my aperture size to get like stronger or weaker kind of depth of field effect. And this is the effect that you see. Like, for example, you see that the farther that I go from the camera, the softer it gets, like more blurry, and this effect makes your model looks more realistic. So you see, like, for example, the neck is really farther, while it's really sharp on the nose here, because this is where my lens is looking at, you know. So this is a nice thing to do, to try to make it look more realistic. So the other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the camera is basically the angle of view and the focal length. So when I use the focal length, I try to keep my focal length to something like between 85 to 100. So 85 is nice. And then the other thing that I try to do is that the angle of view. I try to see the angle of view here, so it's like on 23, like almost 24, and that's kind of like the range of the angle of view that I'm gonna be using in my ZBrush. So in my ZBrush here it says 90. Let's make it 24, and that's the angle of view that I'm using. It will never be exactly the same, and I'm really waiting for Pixelogic to get like the realistic camera inside ZBrush in the next version. But basically, that's what I'm using. There's a lot of people who keep asking me about what angle view that I'm using inside ZBrush when I'm sculpting, like for likeness. And the best thing that I found, and I think all the likeness sculptors, they found the same thing, is basically something in between 20 and 30. So don't go more than 30 and don't go less than 20. And of course, never sculpt on the 90, which is the default that comes with ZBrush. So that's basically it for the camera. So yeah, guys, that's basically like the whole thing for the skin shader, or the like the shading in general, and the scene in Maya, and the model and the preparation of the model. I was thinking about making this video like like also talking about the eyes, but since I knew that it's gonna be a long video about only the skin, so I thought that let's keep the eyes for another video. So maybe next video I'm gonna be like talking about the eyes, especially that the shader for the eye is not the shader only, the shader and the model itself for the eyes is a little bit tricky, so it's gonna take like longer time to explain that. So I'm gonna keep this for next video. I already started like testing around and playing around with Mike's eyes. So these were like some tests, and then like fixing like likeness, like make him squinting a little bit. As you can see, guys, this is the result when I have like lower samples. So you can see that the subsurface scattering is like really noisy, but it is really fast. Like when I am rendering on this, I render in 1 minute, but when I am rendering on that, I'm rendering in this. So yeah, like 15 minutes here. So it took me 15 minutes to render this one, like on higher samples, like on 7 and 2 everywhere and 3 on subsurface. So yeah, so I started already to like play around with Mike's eyes. I'm gonna change them. The color is really close to Walter's eyes, but there is a little bit of difference. So I will try to like make the eyes look more like Walter's eyes. But yeah, I was just playing around. There is no crankula yet. You know, you can see that it is empty here. So I will try to talk about eyes in the next video, guys. So expect the next video next week. And in the meantime, please just tell me if you have any questions, if you want me to like go in depth about any of the things that I talked about in like the rendering or shading part, and you think that I went like quickly over, just write me a question or whatever, and I will try to like go more in depth about that in the next video while I'm talking about the eyes. But yeah, for now I think this is enough for the skin shading. And if you have any questions, guys, just tell me. And I am really happy about the progress that we are having. We've been on Patreon now for 2 weeks, and we are already like skin shading and using our maps. So and this is our 4th video, so I'm really happy about the progress, and I hope you guys too are happy. And yeah, let's talk about eyes and finish the whole skin shading and eyes shading in the next video, and then we're gonna move on to grooming, and then we're gonna start to finally see our model coming to life. So that's it, guys, for now, and see you next week.